Lukeman is a graduate of the University of Jordan and is from Amman. He came to the Clinton School after doing some work at the University of Delaware. He has done extensive international travel. He is fluent in 4 languages and learning a 5th, Japanese. He has been accepted to the Bowen Law School, where he will be one of our students pursuing the joint JD MPS degree. This summer, he will work at the Clinton Global Initiative in New York. And so we're glad that he's going to be in Arkansas for the next 2 or 3 years, continuing his education. Would you welcome Lukeman Arsalan?
Thank you, Dean Rutherford. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Clinton School of Public Service Speaker Series. We are honored this morning to have a person who worked in public service for more than 30 years. Dr. Charles MacCormack has been President, Chief Executive Officer, and a member of Board of Directors of Save the Children since 1993. From 1977 through 1992, Dr. MacCormack was the President of World Learning. Prior to that, he served as an International Research Fellow at the Brookings Institute, Assistant to the Dean of the International Fellows Program at Columbia University, and lecturer at the University of New Hampshire. Dr. MacCormack serves as Board of Chair of Interaction and has served on their Executive Committee. He has served on the Food Security Advisory Committee, Council on Food Security Advisory Committee and the Advisory Committee on Voluntary Foreign Aid, and is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was selected by the United Nations Secretary General to participate in the founding of the United Nations University, which is headquartered in Tokyo. Dr. MacCormack received his PhD and master's from Columbia University. He was a National Science Foundation Fellow at the National Autonomous University of Mexico and was a Fulbright Fellow at the Central University of Venezuela. He received his BA from Middlebury College. He was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Education by Middlebury College and an Honorary Doctor of Law by Clark University. He was also made a member of the Grand Cordon of the Order of Al-Istiqlal by the former king of my country, King Hussein. Save the Children, according to the website, is the leading independent organization creating lasting change in the lives of children in need in the United States and around the world. I was privileged to participate in the Save the Children's Leadership Program 5 years ago in Jordan, and I'm glad to hear Dr. MacCormack here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles MacCormack. Thank you.
Skip, thanks so much for the invitation. And Lukeman, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all for rising before the sky has even become light. I don't know whether it was me that subjected us all to this timetable or not, but I do appreciate your turning out bright and early. It's always hard to recognize yourself in an introduction like that. What's perhaps most interesting is I hadn't been more than 11 miles from home until I graduated from high school. Grew up north of Boston. We'd go into Boston twice a year, once to see the Red Sox and once to see Santa Claus. And that was a real adventure, going to distant lands. So lots and lots have changed. I got a scholarship to Middlebury. My grandparents were all immigrants from Ireland and the Hebrides. So I was the first in my family to go to college, and went as a biochemistry major. So I was planning on going to medical school, and went through my senior year majoring in biochemistry and taking physics and organic chemistry and math and so on and so forth. But analogous to the Clinton School at Middlebury, we had a visiting faculty program. And my junior year, the visiting faculty member was a person named Eduardo Mondlane. He was a professor at the Maxwell School, actually, at Syracuse, but took a semester and came to Middlebury and taught a course on African history. This was in the mid-1960s. He was the director of the Mozambique Liberation Front. So he was the Nelson Mandela of Mozambique. Mozambique was still a Portuguese colony at the time. He had been exiled by the government of Portugal. He was the only black Mozambican to have a university education. So it's an indication of the kind of drive and determination he had, that he found a way to get himself educated when everything was stacked in the opposite direction. And 4 years later, he was murdered by the Portuguese secret police. So paid the price for his commitments. But he gave a seminar on African history. I was a junior, which I took. And his real takeaway was, number one, how lucky we were to be able to have a first-class education, and how 99 people out of 100 would never see the inside of a high school, let alone of a college or university. And number two, since we were lucky enough to have an education and be safe and have enough to eat and probably a pretty secure future, maybe we should think about giving something back. So again, I congratulate this school on carrying forward that message, perhaps better than any other institution of higher education that I know of, with the unique purpose of public service. But he certainly understood that most people in the world, certainly at that time, were not safe, were not literate, were not free, and that those of us who were lucky enough to have those advantages should think about getting involved and giving back. It was the best advice I ever got. That was, as Lukman said, over 30 years ago. And I do have to say I have gotten out of bed every morning excited and gone to bed every night feeling relatively satisfied that the time I've put in has meant something. Certainly it's meant something to me, and hopefully it meant something to others. Save the Children provides basic education, primary health care, nutrition, and protection to 66 million children and their parents every single day. So it's pretty satisfying at the end of the day to go and say that many kids have a better future because of what a lot of good people have been able to do. So instead of going on to medical school, I did, as Lukman said, go to Columbia University and got a PhD in international economics and international relations, and then I spent a year in Venezuela teaching at the National University there, and another year in Mexico teaching at the National University of Mexico, and came back and began working at the School for International Training, World Learning, Save the Children, etc. So it's been a very, very rewarding opportunity. And again, I certainly have thanked Eduardo Mondlane for his words of advice on a pretty regular basis. His wife and family are still alive in Mozambique, and Save the Children has programs in Mozambique, so I've been lucky enough to be able to visit them maybe 4 or 5 times over the past 10 or 15 years, and to see actually the progress that Mozambique has made in the last 10 or 15 years. Back in the mid-'60s, when I was making my higher educational choices, we were in the midst of the war in Vietnam. We had required ROTC at Middlebury, as most colleges did. So the idea that we would find ourselves was not very practical. Most everybody was going to spend a year or two in the service and go to graduate school and find a job and go on from there. But the progress that I have seen, that I've been fortunate enough to live through over the past 30 or 40 years, has really been unbelievable. And I think it's really important to reflect on the unparalleled positive change that has happened over the past 35 years. Essentially, back in the late 1960s, outside of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, everybody was poor. Everybody was equally poor. Everybody was hungry. Everybody was illiterate. Everybody was sick. My first stints were in South Korea and Thailand, where life expectancy was 39 or 40. And literacy rates were 25 or 30%. I remember visiting a program in South Korea where people in a village were breaking stones with hammers in order to create a little more soil so that they could expand their field by another 4 or 5 extra meters, and where the next meal was a matter of life and death. We're just now signing a $7 million agreement with the government of Korea for assistance programs in Africa. So in one generation, Korea has gone from destitution to global leadership, and over. To take another example, Vietnam, when I joined Save the Children 12, 14 years ago, went to Vietnam, and you'd come into the country, potholed road going into town, stayed in a government guest house because there wasn't a hotel in Hanoi. We were working on mass nutrition programs because there was 85% malnutrition among Vietnamese children. Today, you go, we're doing micro-enterprise programs. The staff are young women with master's degrees in economics and so on and so forth. So in one generation, that's another country that has gone from poverty to modernization. So the good news is that 3/4 of the world's population has really come to enjoy good health, decent education, safety, et cetera, et cetera. And we're really only working on really the final 20% of the job. And definitely the knowledge is there and the tools are there. And for those of you who are students, I do think you will see in your lifetime the end of absolute poverty in the world, meaning having a 40-year life expectancy, being sick every day of your life, never knowing how to read or write, and not having enough to eat. That is just essentially going to be eradicated, as it has been eradicated for 80% of the world's population. So in terms of the tools of basic health and education and so on and so forth, they are certainly available. I also think it will happen, as it has happened, through what you might call public-private partnerships, but cooperation between people and non-governmental organizations, civil society, and governments. And this past year, in terms of international assistance, at least, was a very interesting year because it was the first time since anyone has tracked it that more development assistance came from private sources than from governments. And something like $84 billion of development assistance was allocated through NGOs, foundations, universities, and corporations, not in terms of foreign investment, not in terms of remittances, but in terms of actual investment in education, health, nutrition, productivity. So there's no doubt that global change is more and more driven by partnerships between the private sector and governments. Now, cooperation may be a more highfalutin word than what the process really deserves, because the process remains pretty uncoordinated. And I think the great challenge in the next 10 or 15 years for non-governmental organizations and government is to work out better mechanisms of cooperation. When you're talking about $85 billion of private money for development, you're talking about real money, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking about real money. And I think those of us in the non-governmental world have never thought of ourselves as having that kind of leverage and that kind of responsibility. So the next generation of challenge, in my opinion, in our field is being more strategic with one another and not simply carrying out good model programs, but moving the needle strategically on global change. And in my time at Save the Children, I've really gone from spending 90% of my time on internal Save the Children impact to 90% of my time coordinating and cooperating with other entities. The Millennium Development Goals has provided a terrific framework for many of us to work within in terms of agriculture and nutrition and hunger and education and health and so on and so forth. And so we are slowly beginning to improve our capacities to operate strategically. In any case, for those of you who are students here at the Clinton School, I really would pass on the thoughts of Eduardo Mondlane. You won't have a better life than giving back and taking the opportunity and the education and the commitment that you have been fortunate enough to have and putting it to work in behalf of future generations. And I know you'll do it, and I can pretty much guarantee you that you'll get up in the morning excited every day, even if it is 8 o'clock on a gray and rainy day. So with that, my thanks again to you for getting up early. I'd love to hear any questions or take any comments you might have.
Questions? Dennis?
In relationship to you talking about the massive amount of money and where all that's coming from, and looking at the geopolitical scene and the rise of China and how much more it's going to grow economically, Russia's going to grow more economically with oil revenue and everything, how is their ideology going to change this scene, improving it, making it something different? What's your opinion?
Great question. And I think obviously the world has become much more interdependent. That's become a truism over these years, and we have all had to learn, I think, at the end of the day, to try to listen better to others and come up with win-win ways forward. I'm not sure we have the luxury of doing it any other way. I think that's going to be a tough challenge for us and the Chinese over the coming generation. We look at the world very differently. They obviously have much more confidence in the state to provide strategic leadership to society than we do. But I do think they want a stable future. So my own sense is that the potential is there to work out a modus vivendi between the U.S. and China. I think that the coming years are going to be rocky, probably. They may well wish they'd never gotten into these Olympics. As I do think the next 4 or 5 months, everyone who's got a grudge or a beef or a problem with the Chinese is going to use this time when the Klieg lights are on to shine a light on the many ways the Chinese do things that we don't agree with. So it'll be tough times, but my guess is we'll be able to work it out in the end.
Any other questions?
The annual Food Aid Conference is coming up in Kansas City, and you mentioned child feeding and things like that. What's Save the Children doing in regard to your policy about food aid and the direction it'll take in the future, especially in light of higher commodity prices and all of those things?
It's not my area of expertise, so I probably don't know much more than everybody else here. And Save the Children does not do a huge amount of food aid, and that we do is primarily in emergency situations. For example, I'm just back from the Ogaden, Somali pastoralist region of Ethiopia, where sadly enough they're entering into a time of major food deficit. So we'd be providing bridging food aid to those people in Ethiopia. But as we all know, when we go to the grocery store, I mean, the price of food is up 50, 60, 100%. The days of food surpluses are over. So my concern, I mean, there have been lots of arguments about whether PL 480 is displacing local farmers and so on and so forth. I think those days are over. There's just not going to be enough food to provide for people on the brink of life and death looking forward, because that food is going to be able to be sold commercially at very high prices. So already the budget allocations for food are probably buying a third the amount of food they were buying 5 years ago. So I think the problem going forward is for those people who are facing life and death food shortages, what's going to happen to them? And with global warming and climate change, there are an awful lot of parts of the world that are not going to be able to sustain the populations that they have in the past. And a whole chunk of what's happening in Darfur is really the result of climate change and not having enough arable land to support the population. So I fear we're going to see some real famines and crises because of the price of food.
Other questions? Got one right here.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, Mr. MacCormack. I'm a student here at the Clinton School. Thank you again for coming. You mentioned that now the majority of giving or aid is coming from the private sector. Do you think that trend is going to continue to increase? And if so, do you think it's sustainable?
I do think it will increase. We're obviously all looking at some very stormy economic times in the immediate future and probably for a while to come. But having said that, the amount of wealth that's been created in the last 15 years is unparalleled. So the world is still full of multimillionaires and billionaires. And even in today's economic environment, that $110 a barrel oil is making an awful lot of people very wealthy in the Middle East and elsewhere. And some of those people are also joining in this process, so that the Emir of Dubai, for example, has now committed $850 million a year to education. So the whole landscape of international assistance is changing because the reality of where the resources are is changing. And I do think Bill and Melinda Gates and Warren Buffett have kind of created examples of what you do with your extra $40 billion that are unparalleled. There are an awful lot of other people around with an awful lot of money, even, again, with the economic difficulties. Last year, amongst the hedge fund managers, most of whom are 20 minutes from Save the Children's offices, to make the list of the top 100 hedge fund managers, you had to have made $186 million personally in 1 year. That was the cutoff. So if you made only $185 million, you weren't on the list. The point is, there's still an awful lot of money. And I do think a large number of those people are going to follow the Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett example of putting their spare change into national and global change. And these are people who are used to thinking strategically and investing strategically. I don't think they're going to want to do a lot of little micro projects. They're going to be interested in strategic investments that will make a large difference both domestically and internationally. The demands for impact and measurement and accountability and strategic planning are enormous. I think it's a good thing. I think it's going to continue. My guess is that it will have an increasing role. It makes, for those of you who are going to pursue careers in this area, it makes management or implementation a lot more complicated, because rather than having one government agency, one government program that you would go to and either sink or swim, you're working with corporations, foundations, celebrities, foreign governments, your own government, states, localities, and kind of bringing coherence out of all those multiple sources of support, most of whom have somewhat different priorities, is a whole different task than just going to OEO or AID or the World Bank and responding to an RFP. I think it's a good thing. I think it requires more creativity on the part of the implementers. I think it diversifies the risk. I think it brings more energy to the process, but it's a whole different ballgame than it was even 10 years ago.
We have a question right here. I think you have your hand right there. Jim.
Dr. MacCormack, in light of your statement of the shortage of food that we should continue to expect for a while, how do we then buy the dream that the other 20% is going to come up in the next generation?
It's always been about self-sufficiency in any case. And the progress that we have seen in East Asia and much of Latin America and so on, in the end, hasn't been about the external assistance. It's been about entrepreneurship, education, self-reliance amongst the people themselves. So particularly food aid has been a bridge over troubled waters during difficult times, but not an engine of self-reliant, sustainable development. So first of all, it still, as it always has, is going to take agricultural and entrepreneurial self-reliance. It's going to take primary health care. It's going to take the delivery of basic education. It's going to take the development of universities, and that's going to have to be done locally.
Got a question right at the back. Lindsay?
Thank you, Mr. McCormack, for speaking with us today. My name is Lindsay, and I'm a student here. And with a growing number of children who are being directly affected by conflict in Africa as child soldiers, is there anything in particular that Save the Children is doing to try to reach those vulnerable populations and trying to reintegrate them into society or help prevent their involvement in conflict?
We have a whole range of programs to protect children in armed conflict and civil strife. But all in all, the single best element of safety and protection is education and the availability of schooling. And Save the Children has actually made that one of our 4 or 5 global priorities. Of the 70 million children who won't go to school today, 40 million of them are in conflict-affected societies. So the majority of out-of-school children are in war-torn or post-war situations. You can imagine the kind of vulnerability that puts children in when they're in a disrupted situation, often with warlords and combatants and without any activity. So in order to eat and feel productive, lots and lots and lots of kids get conscripted into armed forces. So we have launched a global campaign, we're 2 years into it, to see that children in conflict-affected states do get access to education, because we have discovered that's the single best prevention in terms of abuse and conscription. And we're having some good success. The government of the Netherlands has allocated $400 million to this cause. The British government has put $250 million into the cause. So something that was getting no attention 2 or 3 years ago is really getting some support today.
You have a question right here.
There's a media trend for philanthropic service with, Extreme Home Makeover and Big Give, Oprah Winfrey's new show, and things like that. And I was just wondering, do you feel like that's affecting this next generation that's watching that? And is that a trend that we can kind of try and help develop even after media has decided that this, angle is old and they're moving to a new, whatever their new angle is going to be past reality shows and TV?
Certainly, using celebrities in the media is an increasingly important part of getting results. So it's impossible, I think, to really not include that in a change strategy. It's been around for a long time in some ways. Audrey Hepburn, a generation ago, brought attention to UNICEF and the needs of children. That was pretty important. And it's even more important today as people obviously spend more and more of their time engaging with media. People are, in general, very suspicious of international development organizations. Does the money really get through? Is there any impact? Does it add up to anything? How do I know whether it's really happening or not? I think people want to make a difference, but they're afraid of being ripped off. And they hear from hundreds of different organizations. How do they know who they can have confidence in, who can they not have confidence in? So if Audrey Hepburn or George Clooney today get on television and say, I was out in Chad, I saw Save the Children's programs or UNICEF's programs, there were real results being had, the people were dedicated, they were not living off your hard-earned money, you should really support this organization. It makes a big difference because they're not paid to say what they're saying. So I think people use them as kind of surrogate evaluators of integrity and impact. So I think it's a really important role, because I do think they don't have a dog in the fight. I just my trip to Ethiopia, among other things, was with Selma Hayek and Jessica Lang, who are working with us on our newborn and child survival program. And they went out and literally saw the village health workers and our workers, and the people are sleeping in huts and on floors and riding bicycles to get to the sites and so on and so forth. So they could see for themselves, and they'll come back and do the 10-second spots and the 30-second spots. And I think people in general will say, good, nobody's paying them to do that. They didn't have to do it. If they think it was a good program, it probably was a good program. At the same time, from Save the Children's point of view, we want to, and we need to be selective about who we're utilizing, because practically every celebrity has an agent saying, you should connect with some kind of charity or philanthropy. It'll be good for your image and your recognition and so on and so forth. And they don't have any interest really in the cause, and it's just a career-building investment on their part. And that can get you in a lot of trouble. Those kinds of people can get you in a lot of trouble. So you want to make sure that your partners on that are also equally the kinds of people you would want representing you, that really care about what it is you're doing. And I think the public more and more recognizes that. There are the Bonos and the George Clooneys and so on who keep showing up and do it year after year and have real knowledge of the issue and aren't doing it to build their careers. And then there are the hundreds who drift in and out with their handlers and beauticians and all the rest of it. And I think people are more and more aware of all of that.
One more question. Come here, Annie.
One of the things I was interested as you talked about the progress we have made and what the challenge.
Please talk to the mic.
I was interested as you talked about the 80% that we have moved on those three areas, health, education, that those particular three things, health, education, and hunger, they're so interwoven.
Right.
What is the relationship between the African Union, its progress, and your organization? Are they, I think population-wise, they have, that continent has a lot to do with that 20% that we've got to try to overcome in spite of those environmental and all the other barriers to food supply. Do you feel that the African Union movement of trying to organize to take care of their own needs is helping you or your organization in any way? The reason I asked that question is because when I was there in Ghana and I looked at the emerging relationship between China and Africa as it relates to the Union, and the projection that they would hopefully by 2015 have the Olympics on that continent, and where the Olympics is now in China. Those are the populations that we used to think in terms of population zero to make sure that we'd have enough food for the population. What is that continent's role in that distribution of the food supplies for the future and your organization?
If we didn't have the African Union, I think we'd have to invent it. It's very important that there is a forum that brings the leaders of Africa together to organize for a collective future. As you know, the colonial powers really divided the peoples of Africa very more than arbitrarily. So the language groups are all split between countries. Lots of the problems we're seeing in Africa flow from that. The ecosystems are divided. So there's no correlation between the boundaries of Africa, the state boundaries, and the economic, social ecological planning that needs to take place. And so there's no other entity but the African Union that's in a real position to do that. Obviously, it's going to take some time. It's not there yet, but as I say, if we didn't have it, we'd be figuring out how to create it. The food security situation in Africa is particularly challenging because the soils are not very fertile, and there has not been much real investment in agricultural research in Africa. So those are the directions of the future, in my opinion. And again, I think what Kofi Annan is doing in terms of developing a green revolution for Africa, the Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation investment in agricultural research and development is also really key. You know, this is all going to take some time, meaning 25 or 30 years. That's, you know, in the larger scheme, not a huge amount of time. But the thought that, you know, a 3-year or 5-year investment is going to turn something like the agricultural situation in Africa around is setting people up to fail. But there's no question from what I know, if we have a sustained 30-year effort to increase agricultural productivity in Africa, soil conservation, agricultural research, new varieties of seed, and so on and so forth, that Africa can be self-sufficient in food in 20 years.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank Charlie MacCormack.
Thank you.